Imagine a moment lost to almost every history book you've ever read. It's the year 105 BC. Two Roman armies, nearly 80,000 men, the largest force Rome has ever fielded, are annihilated in a single afternoon on the banks of a French river. Not defeated, not repelled, annihilated. Bodies clog the Rhone for days. Historians who lived through it later called it the worst military disaster in Roman history, worse than Cannae, worse than anything Hannibal ever did to them. And yet, you've probably never heard of the people who did it. They weren't Carthaginians. They weren't Greeks. They didn't build an empire. They didn't leave us grand ruins. And Rome made absolutely sure that their name would fade into the background noise of history. Because admitting how close they came to ending Rome before it even became an empire was too humiliating to preserve. Today we're resurrecting three of these forgotten enemies, three peoples who terrified Rome so badly that the mere mention of their name, decades later, could still make Roman soldiers refuse to march. Three civilizations history chose to forget, but Rome never did. By the end of this video, you'll understand why one Roman historian wrote that after facing the first of these enemies, Rome fell into a panic so total it had a name of its own. You'll learn about a one-eyed shepherd who humiliated Rome's finest generals for 8 straight years. And you'll discover a mountain people so feared that Roman soldiers were taught to dread a single word associated with their homeland, a word we're going to reveal a little later, so stick with me. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's meet the nightmare Rome never wanted you to remember. Number 1. The Cimbri, the wave that almost drowned Rome, the people who came from nowhere. Picture the north of Europe in the closing years of the 2nd century BC, a cold, half-mapped edge of the known world that Roman geographers barely understood. Somewhere in the Jutland Peninsula, in what's now Denmark, a people called the Cimbri lived a life the Mediterranean world knew almost nothing about. We don't have their side of the story. Not a single Cimbric text, not a single Cimbric voice survives. Everything we know about them comes from the people who feared them, which means everything we know about them is a story about fear itself. According to Roman and Greek writers, the Cimbri didn't set out to conquer Rome. They set out because their land was drowning. Ancient sources describe a catastrophic flood, the sea swallowing their homeland, that forced an entire people, men, women, children, elders, cattle, and wagons, to simply start walking. Not an army, a civilization in motion. And this detail matters more than you might think, because it changes the entire nature of the threat. This wasn't a raiding party looking for plunder. This was a nation without a home, searching for one, and that kind of enemy doesn't retreat when it loses a battle. It doesn't negotiate a peace and go back across a border. It has nowhere else to go. That's the first secret hiding inside this story. Rome wasn't just fighting soldiers. Rome was fighting the momentum of an entire displaced people, and in a moment, you'll see exactly what that momentum did to the mightiest legions in the Mediterranean. The first warning Rome ignored, the Cimbri, joined by another people called the Teutones, began migrating south sometime around 120 BC, drifting through Central Europe like a slow-moving storm system. Along the way, they picked up allies, the Ambrones, elements of Celtic tribes, swelling into a coalition that, by some ancient estimates, may have numbered several 100,000 people, though modern historians treat the biggest of those numbers with real skepticism. What we do know is this: when they finally brushed up against Roman territory in Noricum, in modern-day Austria, around 113 BC, Rome sent an army to deal with what it assumed was just another troublesome barbarian nuisance. The result was the Battle of Norea, and it was a disaster. The Roman army was crushed. And here's the detail that should have made every senator in Rome sit up in horror. The Cimbri didn't press their advantage. They didn't march on Rome. They simply turned and kept moving, drifting westward into Gaul, seemingly indifferent to the fact that they had just humiliated one of the most feared military machines in the ancient world. Rome breathed a sigh of relief. That relief would prove to be one of the most catastrophic misreadings in its history. And it's about to get much, much worse. Because what happened next wasn't just a defeat. It was about to become the single bloodiest day in the history of the Roman Republic. And the reason it happened reveals something Rome desperately didn't want repeated. Their own arrogance nearly ended them, not the enemy's strength alone. Arausio, the day Rome nearly ceased to exist. By 105 BC, the Cimbri and their allies had drifted towards southern Gaul, into territory Rome considered its own backyard. Rome, still smarting from Norea, assembled an enormous force, 2 full consular armies commanded by 2 men who disastrously despised each other. Quintus Servilius Caepio, an aristocrat consumed by his own status, refused to properly coordinate with Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, a new man he considered beneath him. Political vanity, in other words, was about to cost Rome tens of thousands of lives. Near the town of Arausio, modern-day Orange, in France, the 2 Roman armies camped separately, refusing to combine forces, each general convinced he didn't need the other's help to win the glory for himself. The Cimbri and Teutones attacked. And what followed wasn't a battle so much as a massacre in 2 acts. Caepio's army was crushed first, then Mallius's. Ancient sources, with the exaggeration typical of the time, but rooted in a very real catastrophe, claimed as many as 80,000 Roman soldiers and tens of thousands of camp followers were killed in a single day. Modern historians debate the exact figures, but even conservative estimates describe it as the worst defeat Rome ever suffered, eclipsing even Cannae, the battle against Hannibal that Romans had spent a century treating as their darkest nightmare. Here's what almost never gets said in the mainstream retelling of Roman history. After Arausio, Rome had no army left standing between the Cimbri and the Italian peninsula. Nothing. If the Cimbri had turned south immediately, historians widely agree there was little standing in their way. Rome, the city that would one day rule from Britain to Syria, was, for a brief and terrifying window, essentially undefended. So why didn't it happen? Why isn't this the moment every schoolchild learns about instead of Cannae? That's the mystery buried at the heart of this entire story, and the answer involves the same strange hesitation that saved Rome once before, decades earlier, against Hannibal himself. We'll come back to exactly why the Cimbri hesitated in a moment, but first, you need to understand the panic that gripped Rome in the meantime, because it gave birth to something that still echoes in language today. The terror that got its own name. The fear that swept Rome after Arausio was so intense, so all-consuming, that Roman writers coined a specific term for it: terra Cimbricus, the Cimbrian terror. It wasn't just fear of an enemy. It was closer to a form of mass psychological trauma. Rome began drafting anyone who could hold a weapon. Normal rules about who was eligible for military service were thrown out. The Republic, for a moment, stopped behaving like the confident hegemon of the Mediterranean and started behaving like a civilization staring at its own extinction. Into this vacuum of fear stepped a man who would reshape the Roman military forever: Gaius Marius. Rome, desperate, elected him to an unprecedented string of consecutive consulships, a legal impossibility under normal circumstances, waived because the alternative was annihilation. Marius didn't just lead an army against the Cimbri. He rebuilt the entire Roman military system from the ground up in response to the trauma this forgotten people inflicted. The professional, standardized legions that would go on to conquer Gaul, Egypt, and half the known world, the ones you picture when you think of Rome, exist, in no small part, because of the terror these obscure northern migrants created. Let that sink in for a second. The Roman military machine that built an empire was fundamentally reformed because of the fear inspired by a people history barely remembers. Rome's greatest strength was forged in the shadow of its greatest nightmare. But the story doesn't end with Marius's reforms. It ends with a battle so strange, so lopsided in the retelling, that it deserves its own reveal, because the way the Cimbri finally fell involved a psychological trick that turned their own greatest strength into the reason for their destruction. That's coming up. But first, let's talk about why they hesitated at Rome's open door, because the answer is stranger than you'd expect. The hesitation. Rather than march on an undefended Italy, the Cimbri and Teutones instead split up and drifted towards Spain, then back again, seemingly following old migratory instincts, seasonal patterns, or simple indecision about where fertile land could be found for permanent settlement. Some historians believe they simply weren't organized as a unified conquering state. They were still, fundamentally, a people looking for a home, not an empire looking for a throne. They didn't want Rome. They wanted somewhere to live. This detail is the emotional core of this entire chapter, and it's the one Roman writers were least interested in preserving. The nightmare wasn't a horde bent on Rome's destruction. It was a homeless people whose mere existence, whose search for land, was enough to nearly collapse the Roman Republic by accident. Rome's histories remember the Cimbri as monsters. The more honest reading is that they were refugees who happened to be terrifyingly good at war. By 101 BC, reorganized and reformed, Marius's new legions met the Teutones at Aquae Sextiae and annihilated them. The following year, at Vercellae, Marius and his co-commander Catulus destroyed the Cimbri as well, and this is where that psychological twist comes in. According to ancient accounts, the Cimbri women, seeing the battle lost, killed their own children and themselves rather than face slavery, having been told stories of Roman brutality toward captives. It's one of the darkest, least told footnotes in this entire saga. A reminder that behind the wave that terrified Rome were real families making unbearable choices at the very end of the road they'd been walking for over a decade. The Cimbri, who had shattered Rome's armies and reshaped its entire military identity, vanished from history's spotlight almost as quickly as they'd entered it, remembered only as a threat, never as the desperate, uprooted people they actually were. But the Cimbri weren't the only forgotten force to bring Rome to its knees. Far to the southwest, in the rugged hills of what's now Portugal, a single man, a former shepherd, was about to make Rome's proudest generals look like fools for nearly a decade. And what he did to survive is a masterclass in guerrilla warfare that modern military academies still study today. That story is next. Number 2, Viriathus and the Lusitanians, the shepherd who humiliated Rome, a land Rome wanted but never understood. Long before Rome controlled Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula was a patchwork of fiercely independent peoples, and among the most feared were the Lusitanians, inhabitants of the rugged, mountainous terrain of what is now central Portugal and western Spain. Rome, fresh off its victories against Carthage, saw Hispania as a natural extension of its growing dominion. What it got instead was 2 decades of humiliation at the hands of a people it consistently underestimated. The Lusitanians weren't a centralized kingdom with grand cities and monuments. They were a network of clans, herders, and warrior farmers who knew their mountains and forests better than any Roman surveyor ever could. And that knowledge would become the single greatest weapon ever used against the Roman war machine, more effective, in its own way, than the Cimbri's overwhelming numbers. Rome's approach to the Lusitanians in the mid-2nd century BC was brutal even by Roman standards, and this brutality is the seed of everything that follows. So pay close attention, because this betrayal is about to produce the most dangerous individual guerrilla leader Rome ever faced. The betrayal that created a legend. In 150 BC, the Roman governor Servius Sulpicius Galba did something so treacherous that even some Romans were disgusted by it. After years of raids and skirmishes, Galba offered the Lusitanians a peace deal, resettlement onto fertile land, an end to the fighting. Thousands of Lusitanians, exhausted by years of war, accepted. They disarmed. They came in peace, trusting a Roman promise. Galba then divided them into 3 groups and had them massacred. Ancient sources suggest tens of thousands were killed or enslaved in cold blood, in direct violation of the truce Rome itself had offered. It's hard to overstate how significant this betrayal is to everything that follows. Among the handful of survivors who escaped that massacre was a man named Viriathus, and what he would go on to do to the Roman Republic over the next 8 years is one of the great underdog stories in military history, a story so effective that Rome, in the end, couldn't even manage to beat him fairly. We'll get to exactly how they finally won in a moment, and it's a detail that reveals more about Rome's fear of this man than almost anything else in this entire video. The shepherd who became a general. Ancient sources describe Viriathus as having once been a shepherd, a detail Roman writers likely emphasized to make his subsequent successes seem almost supernatural. How could a mere herdsman consistently outmaneuver professional Roman generals, men trained in the doctrines that had already conquered Carthage and Macedon? The answer is that Viriathus didn't fight the kind of war Rome was built to win. Rome's legions were devastating in open battle, disciplined, heavily armored, superbly drilled, so Viriathus simply refused to give them that battle. Instead, he turned the mountains and forests of Lusitania into a weapon. He used ambushes, feigned retreats, and deep knowledge of terrain to lure Roman armies into traps where their discipline and heavy equipment became liabilities instead of strengths. In 147 BC, he annihilated a Roman force under commander Gaius Vatilius, reportedly killing the general and destroying his army almost entirely. This wasn't a fluke. Over the following years, Viriathus repeatedly humiliated a succession of Roman commanders, at times forcing entire Roman armies into such desperate positions that they were made to surrender under humiliating terms just to survive. Terms the Roman Senate would later refuse to honor, in an eerie, shameful echo of what had been done to his own people at Galba's hands. Here's the detail that should stop you in your tracks. For nearly a decade, a coalition of shepherd warriors from a backward, non-urbanized society consistently defeated the same military system that had crushed Carthage, Macedonia, and the Seleucid Empire. Rome, the superpower of the Mediterranean, could not solve the problem of Viriathus through conventional warfare, not once. So how did they finally stop him? This is where the story turns genuinely dark, and where you start to see just how much Rome feared this man, because in the end, they didn't dare face him in a fair fight ever again. The assassination Rome never admitted to loudly. By 117 BC, after years of failure, Roman commanders resorted to something they rarely needed against a barbarian enemy: bribery and betrayal. According to ancient sources, 3 men close to Viriathus, sent by him as envoys to negotiate with Rome, were secretly bribed by the Roman commander Marcus Popilius Laenas. Some sources name Servilius Caepio, a relative of the same family, humiliated at Arausio decades later. A strange thread connecting these 2 forgotten enemy stories. These men returned to their own camp and murdered Viriathus in his sleep. When they came to Rome expecting a reward for the assassination, they were reportedly told a line that has echoed through history ever since: Rome does not pay traitors for killing their own general. It's a chilling piece of political theater, Rome washing its hands of a murder it had ordered while still reaping every benefit of it. Without their leader, Lusitanian resistance fractured and was gradually crushed in the years that followed. But think about what this means. Rome could not defeat Viriathus as soldiers. They had to defeat him as murderers. That is how dangerous this forgotten enemy actually was. So dangerous that Rome's proudest legions had to resort to the same kind of betrayal Galba had used against his people in the first place. There's one more secret buried in this chapter, and it's one modern historians still argue about. Some scholars believe Viriathus's guerrilla tactics, his refusal to meet Rome on its own terms, quietly influenced how later Roman commanders thought about asymmetric warfare in Spain and beyond, centuries before the term guerrilla warfare even existed. A shepherd from a people history barely remembers may have shaped Roman military thinking in ways their own textbooks never fully credited. Now, let's head back across the Mediterranean to the mountains of northern Italy itself, because our final forgotten rival was a threat that existed almost in Rome's own backyard for over 100 years and forced Rome into one of the strangest, most drawn-out wars of attrition in its entire history. And the word Roman soldiers came to dread because of this enemy is one you've probably heard before, you just never knew where it came from. That's next. Number 3. The Ligurians. The mountain war Rome couldn't win quickly. An enemy hiding in plain sight. Here's something that should genuinely unsettle you. The third civilization on this list wasn't some distant migratory horde or a remote tribal coalition across the sea. The Ligurians lived in the mountains of what is now northwestern Italy and southeastern France, practically within sight of Roman territory. And yet Rome fought them, on and off, for more than a century, in a conflict so grinding, so frustrating, that it barely registers as a single war in most history books. It's usually broken into a dozen smaller campaigns with a dozen forgettable names, which is exactly how Rome liked to remember it. The Ligurians weren't trying to conquer Rome. They didn't have the numbers of the Cimbri or a legendary commander like Viriathus. What they had was something arguably more frustrating for Rome to deal with. A landscape that made conventional conquest almost impossible, and a culture of independence that refused to simply accept defeat, no matter how many times Roman armies marched through their territory. Why Rome feared the mountains more than the men. Ancient writers describe Liguria as a land of steep, forested peaks, narrow passes, and a population that lived a hardy, semi-pastoral lifestyle completely unlike the urbanized city-states Rome was used to absorbing. There was no central Ligurian capital to capture, no king to defeat in a single decisive battle, no treasury to seize that would end the resistance in one stroke. Defeating the Ligurians meant defeating dozens of independent, mountain-hardened communities one by one, and every single one of them knew their terrain infinitely better than the legions sent against them. This is the secret at the heart of the Ligurian threat. It wasn't the danger of a single catastrophic battle. It was the danger of an enemy that simply would not stay defeated. Roman commanders would win a campaign, declare victory, return home for their triumph, and within a few years, fighting would flare up again in the same mountains, as if nothing had happened at all. Roman sources describe the Ligurians as exceptionally tough, hardened by a harsh environment, and a lifestyle that bred endurance most Roman soldiers, used to fighting on open plains, simply weren't prepared for. Ambushes in narrow mountain passes were devastating against heavily equipped legionaries who couldn't maintain their disciplined battle formations on uneven, wooded terrain. The same fundamental weakness that Viriathus would later exploit in Hispania, playing out here first, decades earlier, in Rome's own front yard. The war that never seemed to end. Rome's conflicts with the Ligurians stretched from the early 2nd century BC through multiple generations of consuls. each one hoping to be the general who finally, permanently pacified the region, and each one, in the long run, largely failing to do so in any lasting sense. Roman historians recorded triumph after triumph over the Ligurians, an almost comedic repetition that, read carefully, reveals not Roman dominance, but Roman frustration. You don't celebrate the same victory a dozen times over multiple decades unless the enemy keeps getting back up. Some Roman campaigns against Ligurian communities involved tactics that verged on the genocidal: mass enslavements, forced population transfers of entire communities to distant parts of Italy, deliberate attempts to break Ligurian society by scattering its people far from their ancestral mountains. This is one of the darker, less discussed truths hiding behind Rome's civilizing narrative. When an enemy couldn't be defeated militarily in any permanent way, Rome increasingly turned to demographic warfare, dismantling a people's ability to exist as a cohesive society at all, rather than admit that its legions simply couldn't finish the job on the battlefield. And here's a detail that connects directly back to something we mentioned right at the start of this video. The word Roman soldiers came to dread. Some historians trace the enduring Roman association between the word Liguria and sheer, grinding military frustration to this exact era, a region whose very name became, informally, shorthand among Roman soldiers for a campaign that promised no easy glory, no decisive triumph, and no clean end. Not a monster to be slain in a single battle, but a slow, exhausting war of attrition against people who simply refuse to disappear. The quiet victory nobody celebrates. Eventually, by the late 2nd century and into the 1st century BC, Roman control over Liguria did solidify, not through one dramatic conquest, but through generations of relentless pressure, road building, colonization, and the slow, grinding attrition of Ligurian independence. It's one of the least cinematic conquests in Roman history, and that's exactly why it's been forgotten. There's no Cannae-style disaster to remember them by, no legendary guerrilla leader like Viriathus to build a legend around. Just 100 years of a mountain people refusing, again and again, to accept that they'd already lost, forcing Rome to spend a century's worth of resources, blood, and political attention on a minor enemy in its own backyard. That, in its own way, might be the most quietly terrifying story of the three. The Cimbri nearly ended Rome in an afternoon. Viriathus humiliated Rome for 8 years before betrayal finished what battle couldn't. The Ligurians did something arguably harder to defend against. They simply refused to stop being a problem for 100 years in a war so unglamorous that history simply stopped bothering to tell it. Why Rome needed you to forget them? Here's the pattern hiding underneath all three of these stories, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Rome's official history, the version handed down through generations, carved into monuments, celebrated in triumphal processions through the city, is a story of inevitable Roman greatness. Enemies exist in that story, mainly as obstacles for Rome to overcome on its unstoppable rise to empire. But the real history, the one buried underneath the propaganda, tells a very different story. It tells us that Rome was, on multiple occasions, brought to the absolute edge of collapse, not by Carthage, not by the Greek kingdoms everyone remembers, but by a displaced people searching for a homeland, a shepherd avenging a massacre, and a mountain population that simply refused to stay conquered. These weren't the great civilizations of the ancient world. They didn't leave behind marble temples or written philosophies, and that's precisely why it was so easy for Rome to erase them from the narrative afterward, to reduce the Cimbri to a footnote about a military reform, to reduce Viriathus to a brief and uncomfortable chapter about Roman treachery, to reduce the Ligurians to a repetitive list of forgettable triumphs. But for a few critical years, at Arausio, in the mountains of Lusitania, in the passes of Liguria, These forgotten peoples held the fate of the most powerful civilization in the Mediterranean in their hands. And that's a story worth remembering, even if Rome spent centuries making sure the rest of the world wouldn't. If Rome's official history is the story written by the winners, then this, the story of the people who almost weren't losers at all, deserves to be told too.